Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This lesson is about stakeholder and communications management documents. Part 2. There's one more stakeholder analysis model that we'd like to go through, and that is the stakeholder salience model. This classifies stakeholders based on their power, their urgency, which is basically their interest, and their legitimacy, or the appropriateness of their involvement in the project. Sometimes proximity is used in place of legitimacy, which is the level of involvement in the project. However, we'll stick with legitimacy. In this context, salience basically means importance. As with the other stakeholder analysis models, the salience model helps you to analyze, categorize, prioritize, and plan engagement strategies for your project stakeholders. In the salience model, these three different parameters or variables are mapped into this sort of Venn diagram of power, legitimacy, and urgency overlapping like this. For those stakeholders who are in just one of these circles, they're known as latent stakeholders. Those that are in two of these circles are called expectant stakeholders, and the one here in the middle labeled core that's in all three are known as the definitive stakeholders. Again, you can put all this into a spreadsheet with some formulas and some conditional formatting to give you the highlighting and attention that you want to give it. First, let's take a look at the latent stakeholders in the salience model. Latent stakeholders are those that have only one of these three attributes of power, legitimacy, or urgency. The first is called the dormant stakeholder. This is the stakeholder that has power, but doesn't currently have any legitimacy or urgency, that is, interest in the project. However, you should watch for the very real possibility that people like this will gain legitimacy or urgency and become a significant factor in your project. Examples include people that are wealthy or that have celebrity status. As these types of people get involved in your project, they can have a significant impact. Similarly, this could also include disgruntled former employees. They no longer have legitimacy or urgency in the decisions about your project, but they could have some power in that they could bring lawsuits against you, or they could go to the news media and bring public pressure against your project, or could even become violent. So it's important to watch for these dormant stakeholders. Then we have the discretionary stakeholders. These are those that have some legitimacy, but no power or urgency. An example that I've seen recently is that there are some dry cleaning companies that will offer free dry cleaning for people who are unemployed and going to an interview. This is something that is philanthropic, that does not need to be done. It's optional. It's a nice thing to do, but not necessary. The last type of latent stakeholder is the demanding stakeholder that has urgency, that is interest, but no power or legitimacy. Examples include stakeholders that make unreasonable requests or that protest your project, even though they don't really have a legitimate reason to be involved in the project. Next, we have the expectant stakeholders. These are stakeholders that have two of these attributes. The first is the dominant stakeholder, the stakeholder that has both power and legitimacy, but no great interest or urgency in the project at the moment. These are people that you need to make sure you keep satisfied, just in case they do develop an interest or urgency. Examples would include shareholders or your local government. Next, we have dependent stakeholders who have legitimacy and urgency, but no power. These are people that you need to keep an eye on because they may seek powerful allies and together can be a powerful force in impacting your project. An example of a dependent stakeholder would be a group of people affected by, say, an oil spill or some other environmental impact. They have urgency and legitimacy, but may not yet have the power to really impact your project, but they will likely gain it. These are stakeholders that are dependent on finding power among other key stakeholders. Third, we have the dangerous stakeholders. These are people that have both power and urgency, but no legitimate reason to be involved in your project. However, these are people that may use their power and interest in violent ways, such as sabotage or even terrorism. And finally, we have the definitive stakeholders, those at the core or center that have all three attributes of power, legitimacy, and urgency. These are the stakeholders you need to keep satisfied and keep involved in the project and that are your focus. It's very common for dominant stakeholders who have power and legitimacy to become interested and develop urgency and thus become definitive stakeholders. These are just a few examples of the different models and approaches to stakeholder analysis and categorization that you can use on your project. Which one you choose to use may depend on your organization's standards and policies, or you may choose whichever ones you want to use on your project. Alternatively, you may decide to use more than one of these models. And now we move on to the next major stakeholder engagement document, which is the Stakeholder Engagement Plan. This plan will include the strategies and actions that you've decided to take to promote productive involvement of stakeholders in decisions and execution of the project. It should include guidance and information on managing the stakeholder needs and their expectations, their communication requirements, and communication strategies for helping to engage stakeholders. It may also include the different types of meetings that you'll hold in order to engage people, including things like status meetings, stand-up meetings, and even retrospectives. This stakeholder engagement plan should provide some overall direction and guidance, as well as be stakeholder specific, especially when it comes to managing expectations and individual communication method preferences. You need to understand what does and doesn't work for individual stakeholders and use those preferences in your communications with them. As with the other management plans, the stakeholder engagement plan can be as high level or as detailed as needed based on the needs of your organization and project. And now we come to the communications management documents, starting with the Communications Management Plan. This management plan describes how project communications will be planned, structured, implemented, and monitored for effectiveness. These lessons are combined together into one because there is a significant degree of overlap with the Stakeholder Engagement Plan. The stakeholder communication requirements and agreed meetings and communications are some examples. Communications management is especially important because it's estimated that the project manager should spend as much as 90% of the time on communication. The Communications Management Plan has a lot in it. It starts with the stakeholder communication requirements, which is why it makes a lot of sense to develop these two plans in parallel, the Communications Management Plan and the Stakeholder Engagement Plan, because they're so interrelated. It should also include information that needs to be communicated, including, if necessary, the language. This is particularly important when you're working with multinational projects. The format of the information, its content, and the level of detail. Format could be things as simple as whether it's graphical or text-based, whether it's sent by email or hand-delivered or delivered in a meeting or a presentation. Your communications management plan should also include definition of your escalation processes. If you have issues that come up that need escalation, how will you handle those? It's best to have this defined up front rather than doing it ad hoc as the need arises. It is very helpful to also list the reasons for the distribution of the information that you'll be communicating. This will help you during the project to make sure that you stay aligned with the purpose of this communication, and you can evaluate better whether or not the need is being satisfied. Also, communication needs to specify the time frame when you'll be distributing this information. Is it going to be at the beginning of the month or what? And you should specify the frequency, whether this is weekly or monthly or quarterly or daily. You should also specify whether you need acknowledgement or response to your communications and how those will be received and recorded. The communications management plan should also specify who is responsible for communicating this information. And keep in mind that it may not be the same person for each kind of information. You may have multiple people involved in communicating different kinds of information at different times to different people. You may also need to specify who's responsible for authorizing the release of any confidential information. You may have some communications that have sensitive information in them that need to be reviewed and approved before it goes out. Also, you should identify the people or groups that will receive this information and what their needs are. Also, the methods by which you will communicate. You can have all kinds of different methods. There are modern software collaboration tools that you could use, or social media, the traditional email, face-to-face communications, presentations, even things such as press releases. Your communications plan should identify those resources that you will need to perform these communications activities. This is especially important that you identify the time and money that it will require to adequately communicate on this project. Also, if this plan needs to be updated, what are the processes and procedures for updating it? Is this something that is baselined and part of your normal change control process? Or is there some less formal method for updating the communications management plan? And are there some parts of it that need formal change control and other parts that don't? This is what you can and should specify in the communications management plan. Also note that there may be technical terms and abbreviations and acronyms that everyone may not be aware of and know the definitions of. So it is useful to include a glossary of these kinds of terms that will be used during the project or in other project documents. Flowcharts are a wonderful visual way to represent the flow of information in your project and to make sure that your stakeholders understand how this information will flow and to get their feedback on this information flow. As mentioned earlier, some of your communications will require authorization before they go out, including possibly multiple levels or sequences of authorization, or a sequence of authorizations that are required. The flowchart is an excellent place to put this information about what authorizations are required at what points in the information flow. Also, of course, you should list reports that are needed that will need to go out, meetings that are planned, whether daily, weekly, monthly, or whatever, who needs to be there, what the agenda should be, all of the details that you can and should specify up front in the project. You may also have other constraints on your communications, such as legal or regulatory constraints. You may have government inspectors that need to come and inspect your work, or others that need to be informed and kept up to date. You may also have some technical requirements that may go along with your quality plan of things that need to be communicated. And of course, you may have your own organizational policies that constrain your communications. And finally, you may find some valuable information and guidance from your organization, including templates for your communications and policies and procedures that have been adopted by your portfolio, your program, or your PMO. As you plan your communications and include all of the contents in the communications management plan, keep in mind all of these different factors about communications. Some, of course, will be written. Others will be oral. And also keep in mind the all-important nonverbal communication, which includes not only body language, but other actions that people can take that communicate things. This is especially important in societies that use indirect communication. Sometimes an action can speak much louder than words. For example, if your key stakeholder shows up at certain meetings, it demonstrates their support. If they don't show up, it demonstrates a lack of support. You will also have communications that are both formal and informal. Formal communications include things like reports and formal meetings and presentations. Note that meetings can be formal even if they're ad hoc. It depends on how they're managed when they happen. Examples of informal communications include sending out emails, posting things on social media or on different internal or external websites, as well as the informal ad hoc discussions that you have all the time in the hallway or over lunch and so on. These types of informal communications can be critical to building the relationships of trust that you need amongst all of your team members and stakeholders. Communications also include both official and unofficial communications. Official communications are things like your annual reports or reports to regulators or government agencies. Unofficial communications are used to maintain visibility and relationships and are often informal. In addition, communications can be categorized as either internal or external to your organization. Some of this may seem rather obvious to you, but it's useful to review these kinds of things in, say, a checklist to make sure that you've adequately considered and covered all of these different facets of communication. Here is another dimension of communications to consider. Communications can be interactive, push, or pull, and these each have their advantages and disadvantages. Interactive communications are, of course, those in which you interact with people directly. This is in meetings, on phone calls, even texting or video conferencing. These kinds of interactions are best with a small number of participants and don't work as well with larger groups because it's harder for large groups to interact in the same way. Push communications are things that you send out. Things like letters or reports or emails or even voicemails, blog posts, press releases, and other things that you send out to people, but you don't necessarily get any feedback or response. And that's the main disadvantage of push communications. But it has the advantage of being able to send out information to a large number of people so that they're aware. Pull communications are things in which the information is there, and if you want to learn it, the recipient of the information needs to go to that source and pull the information to them. It isn't sent to them, they have to go after it. These are things like web pages and web portals, intranets, e-learning sites, even your lessons learned databases and repositories, and your knowledge bases. This is very useful for large audiences or large, complex sets of information. However, of course, it has the disadvantage that people may not be aware that the information is there for them to get, or that there are updates to that information that they should be seeing. To summarize, we've covered 4 things: 2 from stakeholders and 2 from communications. First, the stakeholder register, which contains information about your stakeholders, and your stakeholder engagement plan, which is how you engage those stakeholders. Your communications management plan, which is about how you communicate. The stakeholder engagement plan and the communications plan are very closely related because you need to consider stakeholder needs and preferences and their expectations, and that will drive the needs in your communication management plan. And finally, project communications, which are all of those communications that happen during the execution of the project, which need to be tailored so that the type of communication matches the circumstances and needs of your project. The information in this lesson comes not only from the PMBOK guide on the pages you see here, but also from a couple of other sources, which you can consult for more information. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.